Hey everyone. Tonight, we were drifting back to a time when the world itself seemed to sigh and grow a little colder. So, make sure you're tucked in, lights dimmed low, and let your thoughts slow down, because we're going to wander through the quiet and chilly centuries of what historians now call the Little Ice Age. It's a pleasant name, isn't it? Little Ice Age. It makes it sound like a charming frost on the windowsill, or a brisk morning walk with a scarf. In reality, it was centuries of unreliable harvests, rivers freezing over, and villagers looking suspiciously at their goats, wondering if it was time for dinner. But let's not rush to the famine. We'll get there slowly. The Little Ice Age wasn't one single cold winter, but rather a long stretch roughly from the 14th century into the 19th when temperatures across Europe consistently dipped. Crops failed often enough to make people nervous. Storms grew worse, glaciers expanded, and some summers were so dreary that you'd wonder if the sun had simply quit and taken an extended holiday. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it shaped entire societies. And tonight, we'll stroll gently through how ordinary people, peasants, traders, monks, and the occasionally clueless noble managed to live through it. Let's begin, softly, with the rivers. In England, the Thames froze solid. Not once, but multiple times. Today, a frozen river would bring panic about burst pipes and traffic delays. Back then, people looked at the frozen Thames and thought, an opportunity. So, naturally, they set up markets, called frost fairs, right on the ice. Imagine wandering a medieval carnival on a frozen river. Stalls selling roasted chestnuts, ale poured from barrels sitting on the ice. Gambling games that, no doubt, ended in arguments. Because of course they did. And yes, if the ice cracked, that was a problem. But people were cheerfully reckless. It was as if nature itself had given them a new town square. So why not set up shop? The French had their own challenges. In northern France, especially in Normandy, poor harvests became routine. Bread, the cornerstone of life, grew expensive. People survived by mixing grains with whatever was available: rye, barley, chestnut flour. Sometimes the bread was so coarse it resembled a brick more than food, but you'd eat it anyway, because the alternative was hunger. If you were wealthy, you might sigh and complain about the lack of good wine, which is the kind of complaint that keeps historians shaking their heads centuries later. Now, let's drift toward the villages. Picture a small thatched settlement, smoke curling from chimneys, people wrapped in wool and layers of whatever scraps they could sew together. Winters stretched on, and food had to be rationed carefully. Root cellars, those underground storage pits, became lifelines. Potatoes weren't widely available yet. They'd arrive later from the New World. So, families relied on turnips, cabbages, dried peas, bland, but they kept people alive. The luxury of a juicy roast was rare, unless you were the local lord, in which case your diet remained relatively untouched, until of course the peasants started complaining loudly enough, and about those lords. They often wrote about the cold winters in letters, journals, and account books, sometimes with genuine concern, sometimes with the detached tone of someone who had a full fireplace and a pantry stocked with salted meat. One nobleman in France lamented that the wine froze in his cellar, which sounds dreadful until you remember that his tenants were eating bark flour bread. Perspective, as always, was optional among the elite. Meanwhile, in Central Europe, the cold reshaped entire economies. Trade routes slowed when rivers and passes froze. Merchants had to adapt, hauling goods over snow-packed roads. Inns became crowded way stations filled with travelers grumbling about the weather. Naturally, innkeepers raised prices, because some things never change. The irony is that while many peasants suffered, certain trades actually thrived. Fur traders, for example, enjoyed booming business. A colder world meant more demand for warm pelts. Squirrels, foxes, and beavers became unexpectedly valuable, though probably not very pleased about it. Religion, too, took on new shades during the Little Ice Age. People sought meaning in the worsening weather. Some believed the cold was divine punishment. Others saw it as a test of endurance. Church sermons emphasized patience and faith. Though it is fair to assume that patience wore thin during the third bad harvest in a row, superstition crept in as well. Witches were blamed for storms, because clearly your elderly neighbor stirring herbs in a pot was responsible for an entire continent's climate shift. This scapegoating didn't end well for many women, and occasionally men who were accused and punished for whether they had nothing to do with it. It was easier, it seems, to burn a neighbor than to understand climate patterns. Let's pause and take a slower step into the everyday lives of families. Imagine a winter evening. The entire family huddles close to the hearth because the rest of the house is freezing. Light comes from a fire or a dim candle, smoky and flickering. Children are wrapped in whatever blankets exist, and parents are trying to stretch what food remains in the pot. A thin stew, perhaps flavored with dried herbs, bread rationed carefully, stories told to distract from hunger. Outside, the snow piles higher, and the village dog looks thoroughly unimpressed. But survival also brought innovation. Farmers experimented with crop rotation and hardy grains. Communities learned to store more food when they could, building granaries and developing systems of shared resources. Some villages even regulated who could cut firewood to prevent entire forests from vanishing in desperate winters. It wasn't perfect, but small adjustments helped people scrape through. And then, of course, there were the artists. Strangely, the colder climate gave rise to hauntingly beautiful depictions of winter landscapes. Painters in the Low Countries, like Peter Bruegel, the Elder, captured scenes of villages in snow, children skating on ice, peasants trudging home with firewood. They look charming to us now, but behind those images lay the reality of hardship. Art, as it often does, made the suffering look picturesque. So, the Little Ice Age wasn't just cold. It was a centuries-long stress test on human endurance, society, and culture. Some coped with innovation, others with denial, and many with a weary shuffle through yet another long winter. And through it all, life went on, because what else was there to do? Let's gently drift, then, to the next corner of this frozen story. The bizarre ways people celebrated, suffered, and sometimes thrived, when the world seemed determined to freeze over. So, let's wander back onto that frozen Thames. Because really, it's too good an image to leave behind. Imagine standing on thick river ice, a thin fog curling over the surface, and in front of you rows of makeshift stalls. Some sold books, hastily printed pamphlets, or little trinkets meant to commemorate the novelty of shopping on a river. Others offered hot drinks, which is a polite way of saying spiced alcohol disguised as medicine. Gambling tables appeared, because naturally if people have a flat surface, someone will set up dice. These frost fairs became almost legendary. In 1608, for instance, the ice was thick enough that printers hauled their presses onto the river itself. People bought little souvenir slips of paper declaring proudly that they had been printed on the ice of the Thames. It was essentially medieval Instagram, proof that you'd been there, done that, and yes, nearly frozen your fingers off in the process. Of course, for every joyous frost fair, there were the other winters. The harder ones, when the river didn't freeze thick enough to host a carnival, but just enough to make trade miserable. Barges couldn't pass. Food shipments slowed, prices rose, and the cheer faded quickly. That's the reality. Behind every charming image of roast chestnuts on ice was a winter where families huddled in houses, wondering if the bread would last until spring. And speaking of bread, let's drift gently over to France again, because if there's one thing the French consistently cared about, it was bread. During the Little Ice Age, grain harvests were erratic. Winters were too cold, summers sometimes too wet, so the price of bread spiked. And when bread costs more than people can afford, history tends to get messy. Peasant uprisings simmered in villages. Crowds occasionally stormed bakeries, convinced someone was hoarding flour. They usually weren't, but try explaining climate shifts to an angry, starving mob. It rarely goes well. This tension only grew over time, simmering for centuries, until the 18th century boiled over into revolution. So, in a roundabout way, the Little Ice Age helped plant the seeds of French bread riots that eventually became political revolutions. A cold winter here, a ruined harvest there, and suddenly Louis XVI is missing his head. Cause and effect. with a long and frosty delay. Let's drift now to the monarchs themselves, because while peasants were wrapping their feet in scraps of wool, Europe's kings and queens were dealing with the cold in their own special ways. Henry VIII of England, for example, had palaces designed with enormous fireplaces and walls stuffed with tapestries. He also grew increasingly rotund, which likely helped as natural insulation. When you eat enough roasted meat and custard tarts, you essentially build your own winter coat. Not that he saw it, that way he complained about drafts in his rooms, even as his subjects were burning furniture to stay alive. Other royals, particularly in France, wrote letters fretting about how difficult it was to hunt in deep snow. Imagine that. Your tenants are starving, and you're upset that deer are harder to chase. It's almost impressive, in a detached sort of way, how oblivious they could be. But the cold didn't entirely spare them. Castles could be miserable in winter. Stone walls trapped the chill, and unless you sat directly in front of a fire, you were essentially freezing in luxury. Layers of furs helped, but smoke-filled rooms. Fires sputtered, and the damp seeped in. So while kings and queens weren't starving, they still had their own complaints, and they complained often, which at least gave their secretaries plenty to write down, preserving their petty grievances for our sleepy amusement centuries later. Meanwhile, the ordinary folk were doing what they always did, surviving through sheer stubbornness. In German villages, families sometimes took in animals to share warmth. Goats, sheep, even cows, living in the same building. Cozy, if a little smelly. But when the temperature dropped enough, you stopped caring about smells. It was survival by any means necessary. And what about food? Well, people got creative. They made stews from whatever scraps they had. A handful of beans, some dried herbs, maybe a piece of salted fish if you were lucky. In Scandinavia, people preserved fish and meat through drying and smoking, techniques that kept them alive through the darkest winters. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, and in hard times, that was the goal. Now, let's drift slowly into the stranger side of adaptation, because humans, being humans, didn't just suffer. They also invented new pastimes. Ice skating, for instance, became popular in Northern Europe. The Dutch in particular embraced it, zipping across frozen canals on skates made from animal bones or, later, iron blades. Paintings from the era show villagers bundled up, gliding awkwardly across the ice. It looks charming, though one imagines quite a few bruises from less than graceful attempts. Still, it gave people something to do besides stare at their dwindling food supply. And then there were festivals. In some places, harsh winters inspired communities to gather together, celebrating simply to forget how miserable things were. Bonfires, music, dancing, anything to push back the cold, if only for a night. It's a reminder that even in the bleakest weather, people sought joy, or at least distraction. So, survival during the Little Ice Age was a mixture of grit, creativity, and a dash of reckless cheer. People adapted, endured, and sometimes even managed to laugh about it. Though usually not the nobles, they were too busy complaining about frozen wine. Let's drift gently onward to explore how these endless winters reshaped economies, fueled migrations, and even inspired art that still hangs quietly in museums today. Let's drift deeper into the frost. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the cold had become more than just an inconvenience. It was reshaping the way people ate, worked, and even thought about the world around them. One of the most pressing issues was famine. It came in waves. A single bad harvest could be endured, barely. 2 in a row, and entire regions teetered on collapse. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 is often mentioned as the early warning of what was to come. Torrential rains ruined crops, livestock starved, and ordinary families were left with grim choices. Chroniclers wrote about people eating dogs, cats, and worse though, to be fair. Medieval chroniclers often leaned toward exaggeration. Still, the misery was real. Prices for food soared, and desperation followed. Famine wasn't a one-time disaster. It became a recurring feature of the colder centuries, and it was always the poor who bore the brunt. Wealthier households could draw on stored grain or purchase food brought in from afar. But villagers at the edge of survival had no safety net. If the harvest failed, so did their health. Malnutrition weakened entire generations, leaving them more vulnerable to disease. And, as if on cue, disease often followed famine. Plague outbreaks seemed to time themselves cruelly with poor harvests, striking when people were least able to resist. To keep warm, forests paid the price. Wood was the main fuel, and winters that stretched longer and colder meant more trees cut down. In some regions, deforestation became a genuine concern. Local authorities tried to regulate who could cut wood, handing out fines for poaching firewood from the Lord's forest. Imagine being fined for stealing twigs while your family shivered. Not exactly inspiring loyalty to the crown. As forests shrank, people turned to alternatives. Peat bogs in places like the Netherlands became important fuel sources. Digging up and drying blocks of peat wasn't glamorous work, but it provided steady heat, and it left a very particular smell, which some found comforting, and others less so. Still, if it kept you alive through February, you tolerated the smell. And then, there was wine. Because Europeans, particularly the French, were not about to abandon their vineyards without a fight. The Little Ice Age made grape cultivation tricky. Cooler summers meant weaker harvests. Wine became sourer, thinner. Chroniclers complained about the poor quality, which must have been deeply distressing at aristocratic dinners. There are stories of barrels freezing, leaving thick slush inside. Imagine finally pouring yourself a glass of wine, only to find it half ice, half regret. Nobles moaned, peasants shrugged, and everyone kept drinking anyway, because what else was there to do? Beer, on the other hand, thrived. In Northern Europe, cooler climates favored grains over grapes. Brewing beer became both a necessity and a comfort. Town breweries churned out barrels of ale that kept communities moderately cheerful, or at least numb, through the long winters. Alehouses filled with smoke, gossip, and occasional brawls. If you wanted warmth, you went to the fire. If you wanted company, you went to the alehouse. If you wanted both, you ignored the sticky floors and found a bench. Now, let's wander slowly into the world of medicine, because cold winters brought health challenges, and medieval medicine was, let's say, imaginative. Doctors advised bundling up in wool, which was reasonable. They also suggested avoiding cold, damp air, which was impossible. Some recommended specific diets: warm soups, spiced wines, foods of hot nature to counteract the cold humors. None of this solved famine, of course, but it made people feel like they were doing something. And sometimes, the placebo of hope was as important as the treatment itself. As the winters stretched on, migration began. Entire families, sometimes whole villages, packed up and moved to regions that promised better harvests or milder weather. In Scandinavia, some communities abandoned farms that had been worked for generations. As glaciers advanced or soils failed, it wasn't a dramatic exodus, but rather a slow trickle, families quietly leaving, looking for a place where survival might be easier. These quiet migrations reshaped the demographics of Europe over time. Art, too, reflected the change. Painters in the Low Countries embraced winter scenes, canals frozen solid, hunters trudging back with meager catches, children skating. Peter Bruegel the Elder's Hunters in the Snow is perhaps the most famous, and while it looks charming on a gallery wall, the reality was more bleak. The hunters in the painting have caught almost nothing. The village below looks small, fragile, swallowed by a frozen landscape. It is beautiful, yes, but also quietly tragic. Let's pause with the thought of a villager standing at the edge of his frozen field, staring at stunted stalks of wheat. He doesn't know he is living through what future historians will call the Little Ice Age. He just knows that his children are hungry, the woodpile is shrinking, and spring feels impossibly far away. Yet he'll endure, because people always do, with stubbornness and a touch of resignation. And now, let's drift onward. Toward the cultural oddities this cold age created: strange festivals, curious inventions, and the sometimes laughable ways the wealthy tried to stay fashionable, even while freezing. Let's drift now into the curious world of culture during the cold. Because even in the grip of endless winter, people insisted on being people. They celebrated, they dressed up, and they occasionally made deeply impractical choices, especially if they happened to be wealthy and titled. Festivals first. The cold centuries gave rise to elaborate winter celebrations, partly because communities needed relief from the monotony of shivering indoors. In Germany and Switzerland, Fastnacht, we might call Carnival, became brighter, louder, and more defiant. Costumes grew wilder, bonfires bigger. If the weather seemed intent on crushing spirits, people responded with masks, noise, and a good deal of drinking. It was less about chasing away demons and more about chasing away boredom, though of course they claimed it was both. In Catholic Europe, religious processions sometimes doubled as weather protests. Villagers marched with relics, praying for warmer summers or gentler winters. The relics rarely delivered on these requests, but they gave people a sense of control, which, frankly, was better than none at all. Imagine trudging through snow in a solemn parade, only to wake up the next morning to find the frost thicker than ever. Faith endured, even when results did not. And then, there was fashion. Royal courts, even in freezing conditions, insisted on showing off. Layer upon layer of fabric was worn, not just for warmth, but for display. In France, velvet cloaks trimmed with ermine announced status as loudly as possible. Never mind that the ermine pelts shed constantly and smelled faintly of damp rodent when wet. It was prestigious, therefore it was worn. In Spain, where the Habsburgs reigned, stiff collars and heavy brocades remained in fashion despite the climate. If anything, they may have been grateful for the extra insulation. Though one does wonder how anyone could breathe properly with a ruff the size of a dinner platter around their neck. Nobility is rarely associated with practicality. Meanwhile, ordinary villagers layered whatever they could find, old cloaks patched together, woolen socks that had seen better days. If you were lucky, you had access to sheepskin or rabbit fur. If not, you made do. Children often wore hand-me-downs so patched that no original fabric remained. Clothes became a quilt of generations, practical, if not stylish. And frostbite, well, that was just part of life. Fingers and toes were at risk constantly. In Scandinavia, people rubbed snow on frostbitten skin, believing it helped. It didn't, but it felt like action. Elsewhere, herbal poultices were applied. The results were mixed, at best. Many simply lived with the scars of winter's past them: toes, blackened fingertips, ears nibbled by frost. It was less of a medical emergency and more of a seasonal inconvenience, much like we complain about colds today. Now, let's drift into the habits of the nobility again, because they do provide endless entertainment. In the French court, when it grew especially cold, courtiers complained that the elaborate fountains at Versailles froze solid. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, liked everything in motion: water spraying, music playing, dancers twirling, but fountains full of ice, less majestic. Servants hacked at the ice with axes, desperately trying to keep up appearances. One wonders if the king noticed, or simply assumed fountains froze for his amusement. Elsewhere, nobles simply relocated. If the countryside felt too bleak, they packed up for warmer residences. Portable comfort, really. Though warmer is relative, it usually meant a slightly less drafty castle, rather than genuine warmth. Still, movement was a luxury peasants did not have. If your village froze, you stayed, because where else could you go? Let's pause to consider food again, because it was inseparable from survival and culture alike. The wealthy tried to maintain their tables in style. Roasted meats, sugared almonds, exotic spices imported from far away. It gave an illusion of plenty, even when harvests were poor. For peasants, winter meals meant monotony. Gruel, bread, occasional cheese if the cow survived. Holidays brought rare treats, perhaps a goose, perhaps some ale brewed stronger than usual. But celebrations were brief flashes in a long season of scarcity. And then, music. The cold shaped this too. Instruments warped in dampness and cracked in frost. Church organs froze, their pipes refusing to play properly. Musicians wore gloves with the fingertips cut off, playing until their hands went numb. Still, music continued, because it always does. Hymns in echoing churches, fiddles at village gatherings, lutes at noble banquet hall. played against the backdrop of howling winds outside. So, the Little Ice Age wasn't only about suffering, it was also about stubbornly maintaining beauty, ritual, and pride in the face of bleakness. Festivals were brighter, clothes heavier, and banquets louder, precisely because the world outside was dark and cold. People compensated with color and noise. And, perhaps, with a certain level of denial. Now, let us drift gently onward into another corner of this story, the curious rise of witch hunts during these centuries, and how the cold itself may have helped fuel suspicion, paranoia, and tragedy. Let's drift now into the curious world of culture during the cold. Because even in the grip of endless winter, people insisted on being people. They celebrated, they dressed up, and they occasionally made deeply impractical choices, especially if they happened to be wealthy and titled. Festivals first. The cold centuries gave rise to elaborate winter celebrations, partly because communities needed relief from the monotony of shivering indoors. In Germany and Switzerland, Fastnacht, we might call Carnival, became brighter, louder, and more defiant. Costumes grew wilder, bonfires bigger. If the weather seemed intent on crushing spirits, people responded with masks, noise, and a good deal of drinking. It was less about chasing away demons, and more about chasing away boredom, though of course, they claimed it was both. In Catholic Europe, religious processions sometimes doubled as weather protests. Villagers marched with relics, praying for warmer summers or gentler winters. The relics rarely delivered on these requests, but they gave people a sense of control, which, frankly, was better than none at all. Imagine trudging through snow in a solemn parade, only to wake up the next morning to find the frost thicker than ever. Faith endured, even when results did not. And then, there was fashion. Royal courts, even in freezing conditions, insisted on showing off. Layer upon layer of fabric was worn, not just for warmth, but for display. In France, velvet cloaks trimmed with ermine announced status as loudly as possible. Never mind that the ermine pelts shed constantly and smelled faintly of damp rodent when wet. It was prestigious, therefore it was worn. In Spain, where the Habsburgs reigned, stiff collars and heavy brocades remained in fashion despite the climate. If anything, they may have been grateful for the extra insulation. Though one does wonder how anyone could breathe properly with a ruff the size of a dinner platter around their neck. Nobility is rarely associated with practicality. Meanwhile, ordinary villagers layered whatever they could find, old cloaks patched together, woolen socks that had seen better days. If you were lucky, you had access to sheepskin or rabbit fur. If not, you made do. Children often wore hand-me-downs so patched that no original fabric remained. Clothes became a quilt of generations. Practical, if not stylish. And frostbite, well, that was just part of life. Fingers and toes were at risk constantly. In Scandinavia, people rubbed snow on frostbitten skin, believing it helped. It didn't, but it felt like action. Elsewhere, herbal poultices were applied. The results were mixed, at best. Many simply lived with the scars of winter's past-numbed toes, blackened fingertips, ears nibbled by frost. It was less of a medical emergency and more of a seasonal inconvenience, much like we complain about colds today. Now, let's drift into the habits of the nobility again, because they do provide endless entertainment. In the French court, when it grew especially cold, courtiers complained that the elaborate fountains at Versailles froze solid. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, liked everything in motion: water spraying, music playing, dancers twirling, but fountains full of ice, less majestic. Servants hacked at the ice with axes, desperately trying to keep up appearances. One wonders if the king noticed, or simply assumed fountains froze for his amusement. Elsewhere, nobles simply relocated. If the countryside felt too bleak, they packed up for warmer residences. Portable comfort, really, though warmer is relative, it usually meant a slightly less drafty castle, rather than genuine warmth. Still, movement was a luxury peasants did not have. If your village froze, you stayed, because where else could you go? Let's pause to consider food again, because it was inseparable from survival and culture alike. The wealthy tried to maintain their tables in style. Roasted meats, sugared almonds, exotic spices imported from far away. It gave an illusion of plenty, even when harvests were poor. For peasants, winter meals meant monotony. Gruel, bread, occasional cheese if the cow survived. Holidays brought rare treats, perhaps a goose, perhaps some ale brewed stronger than usual. But celebrations were brief flashes in a long season of scarcity. And then, music. The cold shaped this too. Instruments warped in dampness and cracked in frost. Church organs froze, their pipes refusing to play properly. Musicians wore gloves with the fingertips cut off, playing until their hands went numb. Still, music continued, because it always does. Hymns in echoing churches, fiddles at village gatherings, lutes at noble banquet stall, played against the backdrop of howling winds outside. So, the Little Ice Age wasn't only about suffering, it was also about stubbornly maintaining beauty, ritual, and pride in the face of bleakness. Festivals were brighter, clothes heavier, and banquets louder, precisely because the world outside was dark and cold. People compensated with color and noise. And, perhaps, with a certain level of denial. Now, let us drift gently onward into another corner of this story, the curious rise of witch hunts during these centuries, and how the cold itself may have helped fuel suspicion, paranoia, and tragedy. Let's drift now into the cities. Because while villages struggled with failing crops and freezing fields, urban centers had their own peculiar challenges. A medieval or early modern city was not exactly designed for comfort. Streets were narrow, sanitation questionable, and heating limited to whatever firewood you could afford. When the cold deepened, cities became, well, let's say aromatic, in all the wrong ways. Take London. During severe winters, the Thames froze, as we mentioned, which briefly turned inconvenience into carnival, but the rest of the city suffered. Narrow alleys became icy death traps. Night soil collectors, the people responsible for hauling away human waste, found their carts frozen to the ground. Fires burned constantly, but smoke clogged the air, leaving Londoners with lungs full of soot. And if you couldn't afford firewood, you layered up and prayed for a mild frost, which usually didn't come. In Paris, the situation was equally bleak. The Seine froze more than once, halting shipments of grain and wine. Imagine being Parisian and cut off from your bread and your wine at the same time. Truly apocalyptic. People queued at bakeries, shoving and shouting when loaves ran short. Markets became tense affairs. And yes, occasionally riots broke out. Because nothing unites Parisians faster than the suspicion someone is tampering with their baguette supply even in the 1600s. Heating a city was always uneven. Wealthier households stocked wood and coal, filling their grand fireplaces. Poorer families relied on braziers. Small charcoal stoves were effective but dangerous. Many a winter fire began in some tiny room where someone knocked over a brazier in the night. Whole neighborhoods went up in smoke. Imagine losing your home to fire in the middle of an ice-cold winter. Some people must have wondered if God was simply bored and experimenting with new misery. Northern cities like Amsterdam leaned heavily on canals for transport. When those froze, life changed overnight. On one hand, skating became a beloved pastime. On the other, shipments stalled. Grain barges couldn't move. Timber and fish deliveries were delayed. Amsterdam was a bustling trade hub, but even it bowed to the whims of the climate. Merchants grumbled, citizens adapted, and painters seized the moment to immortalize the sight of children skating merrily on frozen waterways. Again, charming to us. Less charming if you were waiting for food that was stuck upriver. Then there's the issue of water. Cities relied on wells, rivers, and fountains for daily supply. When pipes froze, or wells iced over, people trudged to whatever source remained liquid. Crowds gathered at public fountains, chipping away at ice, filling buckets, and complaining loudly. Complaining, after all, is the most renewable human resource. Food in cities grew monotonous. Without fresh deliveries, markets offered whatever could be stored: salted fish, dried peas, preserved meats. Prices soared. The urban poor often went hungry, while the wealthy turned scarcity into fashion. Serving exotic foods became a way to flaunt wealth. Yes, everyone else is gnawing on turnips, but my banquet includes oranges imported from Spain. It was tone deaf naturally, but tone deafness was practically a royal pastime. In Italy, cities like Venice and Florence felt the effects differently. Winters were less brutal than in the north, but still harsher than usual. Venice faced the ironic problem of frozen canals, not common, but devastating when it happened. Gondoliers sat idle, muttering about the unfairness of it all. Meanwhile, Florentine bankers worried about trade disruptions. Money doesn't freeze, but the goods it's supposed to buy often did. Urban entertainment adapted to theaters struggled to keep audiences warm enough to sit through plays. Performances sometimes included extra torches or braziers in the hall, filling the air with smoke while the actors soldiered on. The smell of roasting chestnuts in the street mingled with the smell of singed fabric indoors. Not exactly ideal acoustics, but people went anyway, because what else was there to do, except sit at home and stare at the frost creeping down the walls? Let's not forget disease. Cities were always vulnerable, and the cold made things worse. Crowding indoors meant easier spread of illness. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Outbreaks of plague, influenza, and smallpox swept through frozen neighborhoods. Doctors did their best, which is to say, they bled patients, applied leeches, and prescribed spiced wine. Miraculously, some people survived anyway. Despite it all, cities endured. They always do. Fires rebuilt, markets reopened, canals thawed, and life trudged forward. The resilience of urban communities lay not in comfort but in their sheer refusal to collapse entirely. People huddled together, cursed the cold, and waited for spring. So, while villages fought frostbite and famine, cities waged their own battles against ice, scarcity, and each other. Different settings, same determination. Humanity, it seems, is endlessly stubborn. Now, let's drift onward, toward how the Little Ice Age reshaped entire economies, altering trade, fueling exploration, and quietly nudging Europe toward the early modern world. Let's drift now into the quieter world of economics. Cold may seem like a natural problem, but during the Little Ice Age, it became an economic one too. When harvests failed, when rivers froze, and when storms battered ships, entire systems of trade bent under the pressure. And occasionally, they broke. In Northern Europe, the Baltic trade was vital grain from Poland, timber from Scandinavia, fish from the cold seas. But icy winters often closed ports, trapping ships in frozen harbors. Merchants fumed, sailors idled, and dock workers suddenly found themselves unemployed until the thaw. It was a seasonal slump, written in frost. The Dutch, being resourceful as ever, found ways around this. Amsterdam merchants stored surplus grain in massive warehouses, creating a buffer against the bad years. They weren't philanthropists, of course. They sold it when prices rose, making tidy profits while others starved. Commerce has never been famous for its compassion, but the system worked. Grain flowed, cities endured, and Amsterdam solidified its place as a trade hub. Fishing economies also shifted. Colder seas brought changes in fish migration. Herring, for instance, were both a staple and a delicacy, depending on who you asked. But shoals moved unpredictably, and entire fleets sometimes returned empty. Salted cod from the north became more valuable than ever, shipped down to feed cities far from the sea. The irony is that while peasants starved inland, sailors at least had fish, though they were likely sick of the taste after the 10th straight meal of salted cod. The wine trade, as mentioned, faltered. French vintners complained endlessly about poor harvests. Southern regions adapted better, but northern vineyards shrank. This was no small matter. Wine was not just a luxury, but a staple. Water was often unsafe, so weak wine or beer was the daily drink. When supply failed, it was felt keenly. And of course, nobles fretted most of all, because nothing disrupts court life like a shortage of claret. Economies leaned more heavily on substitutes. Beer brewing flourished in the north. Cider and perry-fermented drinks from apples and pears became more common in regions where grapes sulked. In a way, the Little Ice Age diversified Europe's drinking habits. Out of suffering, at least a few new beverages were born, but the economic ripples went further. Overseas exploration, for example, gained urgency. Some historians suggest that the pressures of the Little Ice Age nudged Europeans outward, seeking new resources. Colder climates at home made exotic good spices, sugar, coffee even more desirable. If your own harvests failed, why not try your luck in warmer colonies? Naturally, this ambition spelled misery for others, as European powers expanded aggressively into the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The frost at home helped fuel conquest abroad. Even warfare adapted. Armies needed supplies, and cold made logistics harder. Soldiers froze in muddy camps, wagons stuck in snow. Commanders learned the hard way that campaigns launched in winter often ended in disaster. Yet kings, being kings, ordered them anyway. And when armies stripped local villages bare of food and firewood, the peasants were left with even less. It was a vicious cycle: cold weather, hungry soldiers, starving civilians, and the kings still insisted on their wars. Economically, peasants bore the brunt. Taxes rarely fell just because crops failed. Lords demanded rents, kings demanded levies, and merchants demanded payment. Families pawned what little they had, or abandoned farms altogether. Wandering beggars became a more common sight, drifting from village to city in search of food. Authorities tried to regulate vagrancy, but when half your population is desperate, there's only so much regulating you can do. At the same time, innovation crept forward. Farmers experimented with new crops. Maize and potatoes, introduced from the Americas, gradually made their way into European diets. The potato, in particular, would prove life-saving in centuries to come. It grew in poor soil, resisted cold, and produced heavily. At first, Europeans were suspicious of this strange root. Some thought it was unfit for humans, only good for animals. But hunger is persuasive, and soon potatoes became a staple across colder regions. In a way, the potato was the quiet hero of the Little Ice Age. Trade, famine, exploration, even colonization all were shaped, in part, by these chill centuries. Cold narrowed some opportunities and opened others. For the poor, it was mostly misery. For the ambitious, it was a chance to profit or to expand outward into warmer, richer lands. Let's pause here, picturing a Dutch merchant sitting comfortably by his fire, sipping ale, congratulating himself on clever grain storage. Outside, a poor family huddles in the frost, waiting for the chance to buy bread at triple the usual price. That was the Little Ice Age in miniature: cleverness and cruelty, survival and suffering, all mingled together. And now, let us drift gently onward to another realm shaped by the cold, the slow but steady changes in diet, health, and daily routines. Because when you live in a world of endless winter, even the smallest habits adapt in curious ways. Let's settle in now with something more intimate: the way cold reshaped daily life. Because while rulers fretted about grain supplies and merchants watched their profits, ordinary people simply tried to stay alive and to stay warm. Diet was the first adjustment. As winters grew longer, fresh vegetables became rare. Meals leaned heavily on whatever stored well: grains, beans, salted meat, and dried fish. Bread remained the cornerstone of European diets, but when harvests failed, it often grew coarse and bitter. Millers mixed in whatever they had dry: oats, even ground up chestnuts. The result was filling, though not always pleasant. People ate it anyway. Hunger rarely leaves room for complaint. Salted and smoked foods dominated. Pork was preserved in great slabs, salted fish packed into barrels. Cheese became more important, offering fat and protein when meat ran short. In some regions, families survived winters almost entirely on bread, cheese, and ale. Simple, yes. Monotonous, certainly, but survivable. The wealthy, of course, fared better. Their tables still offered variety: game from the hunt, imported fruits, expensive spices. Oranges from Spain or sugar from the colonies were prized winter luxuries. A noble banquet might display roasted swan or peacock, partly to show wealth, partly because they had no idea what else to do with such birds. It was a strange mix of plenty and pretense. While peasants chewed their way through their third bowl of watery pottage, health suffered. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making people more vulnerable to disease. Winters spent in smoky, poorly ventilated huts brought endless coughs and fevers. Doctors, when called, prescribed remedies that were often useless or worse. Bleeding and purging remained popular treatments. Herbal tonics circulated too, with varying success. One imagines some of them were little more than spiced water, but at least spiced water tasted better than plain. Child mortality rose in the cold years. Infants struggled against frost, with few protections available. Families wrapped babies in layer after layer of cloth, sometimes so tightly the child could barely move. Better immobile than frozen, they reasoned. In especially harsh winters, even the effort wasn't enough. Parish records from the time show grim spikes in burials during icy spells, yet families endured, and births continued. Life, fragile as it was, pressed forward. Daily routines bent around the cold. Workdays shortened, since daylight was scarce. In villages, much of winter labor was indoors, repairing tools, spinning wool, brewing ale. Men mended harnesses, women spun thread by the hearth. Children helped as best they could. The household became a workshop, every member contributing to survival. In towns, craftsmen faced similar rhythms. A blacksmith could keep his forge going in winter, though he'd need extra fuel. Bakers worked steadily, though supplies wavered. Tailors, perhaps, enjoyed their busiest seasons, since everyone needed thicker clothes. Wool was the universal fabric, spun into cloaks, tunics, stockings, and blankets. Layering was the only real insulation available, and people layered obsessively. Nighttime routines grew simpler. Candles and oil were costly, so darkness ruled after sunset. Families gathered around the fire, if they had one, telling stories, singing, or simply sitting in silence. In colder regions, people went to bed earlier, huddled together under heavy blankets. Some households practiced as sleeps, waking briefly in the middle of the night before settling in for a second slumber. The cold seemed to encourage such broken rest, a rhythm we've largely forgotten. And there were small, strange customs too. In some German towns, communal ovens baked bread for whole neighborhoods, saving fuel. In French villages, families shared meals, pooling what little they had. In the Alps, people carved elaborate wooden masks and held festivals to ward off winter spirits, half practicality, half superstition, but entirely human. It's worth pausing on one detail: how loud winter must have been inside. Fires crackling, children coughing, dogs shuffling at the door, neighbors arguing through thin walls. Outside, silence, rained snow, muffling sound, ice-locking rivers still. But indoors, winter was crowded, smoky, noisy, not peaceful, not serene. Just life pressed close together, trying not to freeze. From these daily patterns, you can sense the quiet resilience. People ate what they could, wore what they had, and endured with a mixture of practicality and superstition. It wasn't comfortable, but comfort wasn't really the point. Survival was. And survival often came one loaf of bread, one bundle of firewood, one extra layer of wool at a time. Now, let's drift onward into the social world, how communities and families responded together. Because while cold could divide, it also drew people closer, shaping bonds of kinship, charity, and sometimes suspicion. Let's drift now into the social world of the Little Ice Age, where survival wasn't just about food and firewood, but also about neighbors, communities, and the odd comforts of shared belief. Cold has a way of forcing people together. Sometimes that meant kindness, sometimes it meant suspicion. Often it was a mix of both. In villages, survival was rarely a solitary effort. Families leaned on each other for labor, tools, and the occasional borrowed loaf. If your cow died, a neighbor might lend milk for your children. If your roof collapsed under snow, villagers gathered to patch it, not out of pure generosity, but because everyone knew their turn would come. Mutual aid wasn't just kindness, it was insurance. Churches played a central role, not only as spiritual centers, but as distributors of charity. Wealthier parishioners were expected to give alms, which priests redistributed to the poor. This wasn't always efficient, and it certainly wasn't equal, but in desperate winters, a loaf of bread or a bowl of porridge from the church could mean the difference between life and death. Sermons often framed the cold as divine punishment, which wasn't exactly reassuring. but at least it gave people a way to interpret their misery. Festivals endured too, even in the harshest winters. Carnival before Lent was celebrated with extra fervor in colder centuries. If you're already half frozen, why not put on a mask, drink heavily, and dance in the snow? It didn't solve the hunger, but it softened the gloom. Bonfires, processions, and music gave communities a sense of normalcy. A reminder that, however bitter the frost, life still had rhythm. Superstition filled the gaps where reason faltered. People blamed bad harvests on witches, leading to spikes in witch trials during the colder decades. Misfortune seemed easier to accept if it could be blamed on the woman next door with too many cats. Communities turned inward, suspicious of outsiders, fearful of strange weather. For all the talk of solidarity, there was always a darker edge. Fear turned neighbors into scapegoats. Folklore adapted to stories of frost spirits, winter demons, and mischievous fairies spread widely. In the Alps, Krampus became a winter fixture, punishing naughty children. In Scandinavia, Nis or Tom's household, spirits were said to bring good fortune, if treated kindly, mischief if neglected. These tales gave shape to the cold, turning impersonal frost into something almost human. It was easier to live with hardship if you could laugh or shiver stories by the fire. In towns, community bonds were both stronger and weaker. Stronger in the sense that guilds, parishes, and neighborhoods often organized relief. Weaker in that cities were larger, colder, more anonymous. Beggars filled the streets, and the wealthy learned to step around them. Still, taverns, inns, and marketplaces provided warmth, food, and gossip, knitting urban life together. Complaining about the weather has always been humanity's favorite pastime, and in the Little Ice Age, people had plenty to complain about. One curious custom was the sharing of fire. In some villages, families without fuel could borrow hot embers from neighbors to relight their hearths. Carrying a clay pot of glowing coals through the snow must have felt both precarious and precious. A single ember could mean warmth for a week. In a sense, fire became communal property, shared and protected like a sacred trust. At the same time, social divisions hardened. The poor suffered visibly, and the rich insulated themselves behind thicker walls. Charity existed, but resentment festered. It is telling that during the coldest centuries, peasant revolts flared repeatedly. Hunger makes people bold, and winter could turn grievance into rebellion. Not always successful rebellion, mind you, but enough to remind lords and kings that frost did not humble everyone equally. Through it all, there was a peculiar rhythm: winter as hardship, spring as relief, summer as frantic labor, autumn as anxious preparation. Communities cycled through this pattern together, carrying stories, rituals, and grudges forward year by year. The cold didn't just shape diets and routines. It shaped relationships, who you trusted, who you feared, and who you gathered around the fire to endure another long night with. And with that thought, let's drift onward into how the Little Ice Age reshaped culture more broadly, art, literature, and the very way people imagined the world around them. Let's drift gently now into the quieter corners of culture. Because even when crops failed and fires burned low, people still painted, composed, and wrote. Cold may freeze rivers, but it never quite freezes the human impulse to create. The Little Ice Age left its marks on canvas most of all. Dutch Golden Age painters turned winter into a stage. Peter Bruegel, the Elder, for instance, filled his scenes with peasants skating, children tumbling on ice, and frozen landscapes stretching into the gray distance. At first glance, it looks cheerful. People bundled up, making the best of the weather. But look closely, and you'll notice the heaviness, the sagging roofs, the bare trees, the weary faces. It was celebration, yes, but also resignation. Later, painters like Hendrik Averkamp specialized in ice scenes, sometimes called winter landscapes. His works almost invented the idea of winter as picturesque. Skaters glide, sleds slip across the frozen canals, while vendors huddle at makeshift stalls. These images became iconic, but they also romanticized what was, for many, bitter survival. The Dutch had turned necessity into art. skating on frozen waterways not just for fun, but because boats couldn't move. Yet, through Avercamp's brush, it became a kind of frozen idol. Music adapted as well. Cold churches echoed with hymns about endurance, divine punishment, and hope for spring. Carols, some of which survive today, took on deeper resonance. Singing together in candlelit spaces must have felt like a small defiance against the frost pressing at the door. Instruments were not immune to the cold, either wooden violins warped, strings snapped, and organ pipes sometimes froze. Musicians soldiered on, producing sounds that were occasionally more creak than melody. Literature carried the weight of winter in subtler ways. Chroniclers filled their pages with laments about ruined harvests and strange weather. Diaries mention ice in wells, snow in May, summers that never quite warmed. Poets, naturally, leaned into metaphor. Winter became a symbol for hardship, for death, and for endurance. One can almost picture some weary scribe by a dim candle, shivering, while scratching out verses about frost-bitten fields. Not so much art for art's sake as art for sanity's sake. Folk tales grew colder, too. In Germany, tales collected by the Brothers Grimm centuries later still carried echoes of icy dread. Stories like the Snow Queen, Frau Hall, and countless tales of cruel winters may have deeper roots in these frosty decades. Cold became a villain, a force to be outwitted or endured. Storytelling, shared by the fire, was both entertainment and therapy. If you could laugh at a frost demon or shiver at a winter witch, you could almost forget the real cold just outside the door. Architecture even reflects the chill. Northern homes grew thicker walls, smaller windows, steeper roofs. Fireplaces became the heart of the house. Not just a luxury in cities, inns and taverns multiplied, offering communal warmth for travelers. Churches built in the 16th and 17th centuries often emphasized heavy stone and narrow spaces, partly defensive, partly practical. Cold shaped not just what people ate or wore, but what they built to shelter themselves. And of course, culture always finds a way to turn struggle into identity. In England, the frost fairs on the Thames became legendary, woven into the national memory as almost whimsical events. In the Netherlands, skating became practically patriotic. In France, the scarcity of wine became a matter of literature and complaint, because of course it did. Everywhere, people folded hardship into their culture until it became tradition. It's easy, drifting through these cultural echoes, to see the Little Ice Age as a kind of distant novelty, a time of charming paintings and picturesque fairs. But beneath the art lay the reality: frostbitten fingers, hungry bellies, smoky rooms, and endless gray skies. The creativity was real, but so was the misery. Both lived side by side. And now, let's drift onward to yet another sphere. The Little Ice Age reshaped politics, because kings and queens did not escape the frost. In fact, the cold sometimes cracked their kingdoms wide open. Now let's drift into the frosty halls of power. Because while the poor worried about bread and blankets, monarchs and ministers faced their own winter troubles. The Little Ice Age did not care about crowns or coronations. If anything, it often made rulers look incompetent. Nothing undermines royal authority quite like a starving population pointing out that their king cannot, in fact, control the weather. Take France, for example. In the 17th and 18th centuries, repeated crop failures fueled unrest. Bread was the staple of French diets, and when grain prices spiked, tempers spiked with them. It's no coincidence that food shortages helped fuel the French Revolution. While Louis XVI fiddled with hunting and locks, Parisians stood in bread lines. Cold winters did not start the revolution, but they nudged it along. When you cannot afford a loaf, the promise of liberty suddenly sounds much more appealing. England had its own frosty drama. The Thames frost fairs may seem delightful now, but in their time they were symbols of government impotence. If the main artery of commerce froze for weeks, it revealed just how fragile the system was. Kings could parade on the ice, buy a novelty pamphlet, or even watch an ox roasted whole on the river. But everyone knew that behind the spectacle, merchants were losing money, and citizens were worrying about fuel. The fairs were fun distractions, the problems ran deeper. In Scandinavia, where winters were harsher still, monarchs faced constant struggles to maintain supplies. Denmark and Sweden both relied on Baltic grain, which was often delayed or frozen in harbor. Peasants suffered the worst, of course, but royal treasuries also shrank. Armies could not march without bread, and kings without armies are, well, just oddly dressed men with fancy hats. Spain, too, felt the frost. Vineyards shrank, harvests faltered, and the already strained Habsburg Empire stumbled under economic pressure. One wonders if Charles II, the famously inbred monarch often nicknamed the Bewitched, would have seemed quite so cursed if he had also been ruling through failed harvests and dismal winters. Of course, Charles' genetic lottery losses were their own separate tragedy, but cold certainly didn't help. The Holy Roman Empire, that famously fragmented quilt of territories, saw countless small revolts linked to food shortages. Princes tried to levy taxes regardless, because naturally they did. When your people are starving, it is apparently the perfect time to demand extra coin for your castle renovations. These choices rarely endeared rulers to their subjects. The icy decades were a quiet backdrop to endless uprisings, simmering resentments, and the occasional open rebellion. Even colonial expansion was touched by the frost. European powers, hungry for resources, looked abroad with greater urgency. Sugar, coffee, and tobacco plantations in warmer climates became essential sources of wealth and relief. Back home, frost stunted vines. Abroad, sugarcane grew tall. The cold at home fed the greed abroad, reshaping politics on a global scale. And then there were the optics. Monarchs loved to present themselves as divinely appointed, chosen by God, fathers or mothers of their people. It was difficult to maintain that image when your subjects were literally freezing. Sermons that once praised the divine right of kings often drifted into sermons lamenting divine punishment. A subtle shift, but a dangerous one. If the king cannot feed you, perhaps God is no longer on his side. Of course, rulers found ways to deflect blame. Witches were convenient scapegoats, as were corrupt officials, or neighboring kingdoms. Anyone but the monarch himself. Still, unrest bubbled. Winter after winter, the chill gnawed at royal legitimacy. By the time revolutions erupted, whether in France, England, or beyond, the memory of icy hunger was part of the fuel. So yes, the little ice age froze rivers, shrank harvests, and stiffened fingers. But it also cracked kingdoms. Quietly, slowly, it made rulers look weaker, subjects angrier, and revolutions a little more likely. And now, let's drift gently onward to one final thread: how the Little Ice Age finally faded, and what traces it left behind in the modern world. Let's drift now to the slow thaw, because, like most things in history, the Little Ice Age did not end with a sudden flourish. There was no grand announcement, no cosmic alarm clock saying enough frost. Back to warmth. Instead, the winters grew a little less bitter, summers a little less damp. Crops recovered, rivers flowed more freely, and slowly, over decades, the world shifted. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the worst of the cold had passed. There were still harsh winters. Of course, Napoleon's troops in Russia could attest to that, but the long, grinding chill of previous centuries began to ease. The Thames no longer froze solid enough for fairs. Vineyards crept north again. Farmers sighed in relief as harvests grew more reliable. The ice had not vanished entirely, but its grip had loosened. The legacy, however, lingered. Agricultural practices had changed. Farmers had grown used to diversifying crops, experimenting with hardier varieties, and adopting new staples from the Americas. The potato, once suspicious and foreign, was now embraced across Europe. It proved so successful that in places like Ireland, it became dangerously central, a choice that, as we know, would lead to disaster in the 19th century famine. Still, without the potato, many earlier winters might have been even worse. Culturally, the Little Ice Age left its imprint too. The paintings of Avercamp, the stories of winter witches, the memory of frost fairs all carried forward into collective identity. Even today, when we imagine a traditional European winter, scenes, no dusted rooftops, Skaters on frozen ponds, we are often picturing images born in those centuries of unusual cold. Nostalgia has a way of polishing hardship into something almost pretty. Politically, the Little Ice Age had helped set the stage for upheaval. Famines and food shortages did not single-handedly cause revolutions, but they added weight to the scales. Hungry people are less patient with royal mismanagement. The French Revolution, the English Civil War, peasant uprisings across the Holy Roman Empire, all of them had roots nourished, at least in part, by empty bellies and cold nights. And socially, the memory of those winters shaped how communities understood resilience. Traditions of charity, parish relief, and mutual aid deepened. Superstitions evolved, but the communal rituals, singing in dark churches, sharing food at midwinter festivals, remained. They became part of the cultural fabric, echoes of centuries when winter was not just inconvenient, but genuinely dangerous. In the modern world, the Little Ice Age sometimes feels distant, almost quaint, a curiosity, a time of frozen rivers and picturesque paintings. But beneath the charm lay real suffering, and also real adaptation. People endured, not through heroics, but through steady, stubborn adjustments, storing grain, sharing fire, layering wool, and telling stories by the hearth. Small things repeated endlessly until the cold passed. Perhaps that is the truest legacy, not just art or politics, but the quiet reminder that survival often comes from persistence rather than brilliance. Ordinary people, in ordinary ways, enduring extraordinary weather. And now, as we ease out of this long, frosty tale, let's take a breath. The Little Ice Age is behind us, but its echoes still ripple through the images we hold of winter, the foods we eat, and even the histories of nations. It is a story of endurance, sometimes bleak, sometimes amusing, always human. So tonight, as the modern heating hums, and blankets are thicker, we can let our minds wander back to frozen rivers, smoky hearths, and the quiet resilience of those who lived through centuries of cold. And with that, we can let the frost settle back into history, and drift slowly, gently towards sleep. The end.